Now that we're in this flat, really inverted yield curve, there is a ton of opportunities that didn't necessarily exist back a few years ago.
Welcome to BuzzHouse, a Baker Tilly podcast where you can hear all the buzz around multifamily housing, with all the info you need to help you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Hi, I'm Don Bernards, the partner in charge of Baker Tilly's multifamily housing practice.
And I'm Gary Gibson, a partner at Baker Tilly, also specializing in consulting on multifamily housing transactions across the country.
Let's get started. We know in these current economic conditions, with the higher interest rates, higher construction costs, among other things, that there are a lot of hurdles to closing your low-income housing tax credit project. On the show, of course, Garrick and I have talked time to time on various debt products and structures that are innovative and bring some pluses to your transaction. That will be the focus of today's show as we discuss with Kent Neumann and Allison King of the law firm Tiber Hudson, the tax-exempt financing structure coined the cash-backed forward structure. We'll get into it, a lot of details, some technical items and so forth. So with a lot to dig into with the structure, let's jump right into our discussion with Kent and Allison. I'm going to turn it over to Garrick.
Thanks, Don. And Kent and Allison, welcome to the show. Glad to have you on BuzzHouse. Before we get into questions to begin, would you please tell us and our listeners a little bit about your professional backgrounds, area of focus, as well as your law firm, Tiber Hudson?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having us on the show. We're very excited to be here. Kent and I started Tiber Hudson along with a handful of partners almost 6 years ago. Our firm's main focus is in the areas of law surrounding affordable housing. And our bond team closes around 250 deals a year, which makes us number one underwriters council and bond purchasers council in the country based on the number of deals closed. Tiber Hudson is special in a lot of ways. Like Baker Tilly, diversity is a top priority for us. We are a minority-owned law firm, and we just received Mansfield certification, which we're really proud of. Mansfield is issued through Diversity Lab, and it's a recognition of law firms that promote minority and women attorneys in our industry. Most of us have finance backgrounds as well, so we really love to kind of dig into the nuts and bolts and look at ways to help structure deals that are going to result in financial benefits. And I think probably the most exciting thing that I love to share with our clients is that we don't bill by the hour. Very unusual for a law firm, but we just really love to collaborate. We have a problem-solving culture, and so we welcome the opportunity to dig into deals, answer questions, and we maintain an extensive database on every deal that we close. So if someone's looking into a new market and have questions about issuer options, that type of thing, we're glad to help.
Thanks for that introduction. That's interesting. You know, you mentioned the diversity. We love that here over at Baker Tilly as well. So let's jump in. I mean, I know everybody's excited to hear about this structure. There have been obviously many bond structures over the last decade, which were created to address the changing interest rate markets. I know like the short-term bond execution and the cash collateralized, the TEL. Let's start our discussion with the beginning, or what was your light bulb moment? What were the circumstances that actually helped you create this particular structure?
Yeah, thanks, Garrick. This is Kent. It's funny, this started about 5 years ago, so shortly after we started the firm, and we started utilizing it in Texas, which is unique in the country. It's the only state that doesn't allow for bonds to be done on a drawdown basis. So a lot of the private placement transactions, including the Freddie Mac TIL program that you mentioned, were geared. And one of the benefits was that it could be done on a drawdown basis and you save that interest cost, especially when interest rates were very low on the short end of the curve and higher on the longer side of the curve. In Texas, since you had to fully fund the bonds and still do, we were working with a developer client. We don't actually represent developers. As Allison mentioned, we usually represent the bond underwriters or bond purchasers, but we still consult and work with a lot of developers around the country on figuring out best structures to work with given their financial needs and goals. And we were putting our heads together and figuring out how can we do a deal in Texas, knowing that it has to be fully funded, but they have a long draw schedule, new construction, larger size transaction. And after some thought, we actually put together kind of a hybrid between short-term cash collateralized bond deal that you mentioned and a long-term tax-exempt perm execution. This was a Freddie Mac execution that started it. And as folks may know, that product revolves around a tax-exempt construction loan, usually a drawdown, not in Texas. And then Freddie provides a forward commitment that comes in at the perm side to buy the tax-exempt loan. what we were able to do, instead of having all the bonds funded day one at the higher construction interest rate that was being proposed, is structure it with publicly offered tax-exempt cash collateralized bonds. They get a AAA rating from Moody's. And Allison will go through the details of the structure, but it basically allowed for all the bonds to be funded day one with very low interest rate costs. In the current market, no cost, which is great because of where the investments are. We'll talk about that in a minute. And allowed the construction loan to come in on a drawdown basis. Sometimes we've heard it referred to as kind of a synthetic drawdown, where you're getting the construction loan coming in over time on a drawdown basis, still fully funding your bonds as you need to in Texas. That was a big success. Allison was on a panel just a few weeks ago, and the developer mentioned a few times that they don't think the deal would have worked without the structure. So that was great. And we've now done it quite extensively in Texas because of those reasons. Then fast forward for another year or two later, we started working on many deals where the equity investor also was the construction lender around the country, not just in Texas. That creates specific tax rules, sometimes referred to as program investment related party issues. The interest to the construction lender is taxable in that context, but it also will sometimes impact the ability for the issuer to charge certain fees above a very small amount, which many issuers are not inclined to do. So rather than having to go and ask issuers to defer or eliminate some of their fees, we use this cashback forward structure to allow the bonds to be sold to a third party initially. And then at conversion, they're tendered back to the perm lender, whoever that is, so that they're never in the hands of the equity investor, which eliminates that tax issue that I mentioned. So we were able to expand the product from that point. And then, in the last 2 years, as everyone has seen and heard, short-term rates have gone up significantly. We started talking to folks like your firm and other firms and developers on the ability to capitalize more interest from the higher short-term bond rates that are in the market today. And that has really now brought a whole new economic dynamic to a structure that was created, as you can tell, from a whole different set of circumstances, scenarios when rates are very low, and now kind of sheds a whole new opportunity for developers to explore and kind of run the analysis between the normal structure, fully funded in Texas or drawdown, versus this cash collateralized structure that we put together. And we are seeing it create significant benefits really around the country in many circumstances.
Ken, thank you for that. A really good background, a lot of good information, kind of that light bulb moment, and we're glad that it happened. Can you address the yield curve where it is today that really makes this structure especially of interest?
As I mentioned, it was helpful in very limited circumstances when rates were super low. Short-term rates were pretty much at zero several years ago, and then long-term rates were pretty much where they are, a little bit lower than they were. Now that we're in this flat to really inverted yield curve, there is a ton of opportunities that didn't necessarily exist back a few years ago. When you have a steep, normal, upward sloping yield curve, drawdown bond deals make a lot of sense. You don't have negative arbitrage. You're not paying interest on bonds you don't need. In the current environment, we're able to invest the cash collateral, the bond proceeds, in treasuries or other AAA rated investments, and there's no net interest cost. With the combination of adding some of this basis that we mentioned into the economics, it really does lead to some significant benefits overall. And the overall impact of the deal, even when you factor in some of the fees we're going to get into when we go through the structure in detail, still can be pretty substantial. We, as the Texas deal I mentioned, saved over 7 figures, I'll say, of additional proceeds. And now we've closed over 60 of these and have several more, probably a dozen or so more lined up to close this year. So it has been significantly helping deals around the country in all different areas. And like I mentioned, if you do happen to have a situation where your equity investor is also, you're interested in doing construction loan, it helps with that dynamic as well.
Well, that's impressive. Over 60 deals to date and growing. Allison, in the big picture, can you walk us through what this structure is doing, how this is working? I know there's a lot of moving pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely, there are moving pieces, but maybe if we think about it sort of, it is similar to the short-term cashback structure in some ways that Kent created over a decade ago. That structure we all know and love and is definitely a bread and butter structure across the country. But there are some modifications, as Kent mentioned. So at closing, the borrower is going to be simultaneously closing on the taxable construction loan, as well as working with an underwriter to publicly issue the bonds. The borrower is going to receive a commitment from the perm lender at closing, locking in that perm rate. At closing, the bonds are going to be fully funded and the bond proceeds will be deposited with the trustee. Unlike the standard short-term cashback structure, those bonds are going to have a long maturity, so around 17 to 18 years, but they're going to be sold through an underwriter to an initial bondholder for only a short period. The bonds are going to be fully cash collateralized during that initial period, as Kent mentioned. So as construction draws are made and those construction dollars are coming in, they're going to be deposited with the trustee, who then is going to release a corresponding amount of bond proceeds to be spent on the project so that they can meet the 50% test. Once the project's complete and the parties are ready for conversion, the perm lender is going to come in and pay off the construction lender, and they're going to go into that senior lien position. So initial holders are then going to tender the bonds to the trustee in exchange for the cash collateral, and any bonds in excess of the perm loan amount at that time can be redeemed. And the trustee is then going to deliver the remaining bonds to the perm lender or the long-term holder for the life of the bonds.
The nice thing about this, to be honest, is that in most situations these days, especially for new construction deals, the bond amount issued at closing to meet that 50% test is usually higher than the permanent supportable debt. But because it's structured as one single bond issuance, the transaction has the ability to adjust at conversion to whatever the deal can support, up or down, up to that maximum amount of bonds issued at closing, and obviously down some to whatever the supportable loan amount is. So that's a nice feature as well, where you don't have to worry about going back and trying to get more bonds or having a separate series of short-term bonds that will definitely go away at conversion and you can't keep them outstanding. There are some added costs. We do want to make sure it's clear that this is not, as mentioned, we're adding some layers on here. We've done so many of these now. We have a nice Excel spreadsheet that we can use to do a comparison on this and factor in the costs associated with it. The main three additional costs are the bond underwriter that sells the bonds, which is our client, underwriter's counsel fees, which are our fees that we charge to work on the deal, and then a small rating fee, which tends to be under $10,000 with some cash flows and verification. So those are aggregate costs that are additive to the overall structure and the other bond related costs. You're still going to have bond counsel, borrower's counsel, issuer fees, all those remain the same for the most part. The nice thing about it, though, is that even with those extra costs, when you factor in the benefits, which could be potentially, we'll talk about in a minute, some positive earnings, potentially, and or additional basis, it's really been well in excess of those costs, and in many cases still generating six figures or more of savings. We have done so many of these as well. We do have very tightly integrated bond documents that we are able to send to bond counsel. We work with perm lenders counsel and bond counsels around the country to make sure that they are all comfortable from a tax perspective. We avoid, in most cases, and we just got approval even in Texas now, coming full circle, to avoid any type of reissuance on the structure that just adds some additional costs and complexity. So try to make that all really streamlined execution. And I'll mention one other location in Michigan, for example. We closed the first two forward transactions of this type. And because of the cash collateral, it perfectly met with their requirements on doing these types of deals that they require credit enhancement. So we were able to close the first two Freddie forward deals there, which previous iterations had struggled with.
Thanks. That's interesting, the way that it sort of played out, just because the fact that these bonds have to be pushed forward and you're kind of eliminating all those different tranches. Obviously, additional fees, it doesn't necessarily matter if the structure's benefits actually cover it. So let me ask you a little bit about that. So what are the key outcomes and benefits from this structure?
Yeah, there's some really great benefits. And as Kent mentioned, there are definitely some different approaches across the country. We want to make sure that we're having those conversations early on and going through that sort of deal by deal analysis. But subject to those participants reviewing and approving, this can definitely result in additional equity, investment earnings, and those types of improvements for the deal overall. And again, just to reiterate, Texas, for new construction deals, this is going to result in significantly lower interest costs during construction.
Yeah, that's a good point, Allison. Especially on variable rate construction loans has gone up significantly. So even though short-term rate investment opportunities exist, the actual cost of debt, even on the construction side, especially taxable, has gone up in an equal, if not greater amount. So even now in the current interest rate environment, trying to do a synthetic drawdown or cashback forward structure in Texas has pretty substantial benefits overall for that lower interest cost.
Perfect. Maybe one more question, a couple more questions actually. A lot of times we talk about structures like this and people in the back of their mind is like, how do we do that? It seems too good to be true. Isn't there like having to refund some kind of, excess yield or interest on bonds? And what are the rules around that kind of makes this, work?
Great question, Don. And, Allison and I have mentioned this a few times, but we do think it's important. We do keep a very elaborate database. We do deals, as Allison mentioned, over 250 deals a year in the vast majority of states around the country. And we just closed a transaction in Puerto Rico recently as well. So we are able to work with bond firms around the country. We do have a good assessment on which firms, for example, have treated this as a single issuance of bonds and have been able to get comfortable blending the yields between the initial short-term rate and the permanent rate. And that does allow the blended yield to often exceed the overall yield on the investments. So that's where you technically wouldn't have any positive earnings if you're equal to or below the bond yield. And so we've seen that approach taken. Obviously, we vet that ahead of time with the particular location bond counsel being used. The other aspect of these transactions, it's important to work with the accounting firms, as you guys know, early on to ensure that the added basis can be factored in the appropriate manner. We have kind of highlighted and mentioned during this conversation that we're using a lot of new construction. It could work in some situations for rehab deals, but that again is some of the details that you want to work through with your accounting firm. And then bring all this to your equity investor, make sure it's baked in up front. As you all can imagine, doing this early on, baking into your LPA and not having to do this after the fact is going to give the whole group a lot more comfort in how the economics work, especially at the conversion process. And then the other thing I'll mention that this does raise, if we're increasing basis, whenever we talk about increasing basis, volume cap is very constrained still around the country. Even in this rising interest rate environment, we keep track of volume cap in every state. And so it is important to make sure that by increasing basis with this technique, you're not also getting closer to your 50% test than you want to, and you have enough bond allocation. Even for deals that we're looking at preliminarily, we definitely suggest always trying to get additional cushion in that volume cap if you have the ability in the state you're working in, and not try to cut it too close for that purpose. The big picture is most of the firms around the country, both on the equity side, the bond counsel side, and the accounting side, and developers have been able to work with these structures after a conversation and a cost comparison and see if it makes sense for their deal.
Yeah, I would just say that we did create this structure over 5 years ago, and we have closed so many of these deals, but it is definitely a highly structured plan of financing. There are a lot of details surrounding investments and sort of the key dates and conversion timelines. And so just making sure that if you're choosing to go with this structure, that you're using a group, a deal team that has a lot of experience in this execution. We've seen a couple of folks try to maybe reverse engineer it, and it hasn't gone quite so well. But definitely not to scare anyone off, but it is a little bit more complex, and just making sure that you have an experienced team on board.
Ken and Allison, that's a lot of good advice. Really kind of thinking about getting that team in place, your account, your syndicator. Yeah, a lot of planning to make sure, but obviously can be very impactful. Maybe just one last question. Any final thoughts? I mean, we went through a lot to think through, a lot of good data, information, but yeah, any final thoughts?
Sure. I would just go back to my initial statement. Of course, we don't charge by the hour, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions. Again, just sort of collaborating on these types of structures is something that we really love to do. And if it's not a cashback forward structure, we definitely have other ideas, but are really loving this execution in today's market.
That's it for today's episode of the BuzzHouse. A big thanks to Ken Neumann and Allison King for joining the show today to tell us all about the cashback forward structure. Once again, I'm Don Bernards.
And I'm Garrett Gibson.
Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. For additional resources around multifamily housing, check out bakertilly.com. If you have a suggestion for the show, email us at build@bakertilly.com. That's BUILD @bakertilly.com. See you next time on BuzzHouse.